A millionaire hires a poor woman to pretend to be his fiancée, but what happened afterward left him surprised. Ethan Caldwell, a successful businessman and owner of one of the largest tech companies in New York, was used to handling business problems and high-pressure situations. However, he couldn't find a solution to a more personal issue: the need to convince his partners and his conservative family that he was a stable and reliable man, worthy of taking full leadership of the company. With every meeting with his partners, the judgmental looks intensified, and the subtle remarks that maybe it was time for him to think about stabilizing his personal life were constant. Ethan knew he had to do something drastic to change that perception. His partners and investors were worried about his bachelor image, and he needed to show he had the emotional stability to lead in a competitive market. It was in a simple cafe in the city center that Ethan found a possible solution to his problem. He was there for a quick meeting when his eyes caught an interesting scene. A young woman, visibly upset, was arguing intensely with an older man who seemed to be a debt collector. She, with her modest clothes and a posture that mixed pride and desperation, stood her ground against his demands. "I already told you, I need more time. Please, just a few more weeks." The woman insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Her soft accent and determined expression caught Ethan's attention. After the collector left, defeated, Ethan approached her with a plan starting to form in his mind. "You seem to be going through a tough time," he said, his voice calm but direct. The woman looked up at him, clearly suspicious, but she stood tall. "Yes, and you seem to be sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," she replied with a hint of frustration. Ethan wasn't fazed by her response. Instead, he sat down at the table and introduced himself. "My name is Ethan Caldwell. Maybe I have a proposal that could solve both our problems." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "I'm Claire Parker, and if you're talking about some charity offer, you can keep it to yourself." "It's not charity," Ethan quickly responded. "I need someone to pretend to be my fiancée at an important event, and I'm willing to pay well for it." Claire looked at him like he was crazy. "Pretend to be your fiancée? Are you serious?" "Completely serious," he said, leaning forward with a determined look in his eyes. "I'll pay off your debts and more if you agree to be my fake fiancée for a few weeks. It would solve my issues with my partners, and from what I've seen, it would also help with your financial troubles." Claire stayed silent for a moment, processing what she had just heard. It was a strange proposal, but she was in no position to easily turn down any opportunity. "And what exactly are your terms?" she asked, still cautious. "You'll need to accompany me to some social events. Behave like a loving and convincing fiancé. In return, I'll clear all your debts and guarantee a significant bonus at the end of the agreement. There will be no hidden intentions on my part. It will be strictly business," Ethan explained, trying to sound as transparent as possible. Claire took a deep breath, knowing that this might be her only chance to solve her financial problems once and for all. "All right," she finally said, "I accept your terms, but on one condition: no lies beyond what's necessary for your show. I want to keep my dignity intact." "Deal," Ethan replied with a slight smile, extending his hand to seal the agreement. Claire shook it firmly, with an expression that mixed determination with a touch of vulnerability he hadn't expected to see. As they shook hands, both knew they were entering into an agreement that would change their lives in ways they couldn't yet predict. The days following the agreement were a whirlwind for Claire Parker. She found herself transported from her simple and tough reality to the sophisticated and highly polished world of Ethan Caldwell. He had organized a series of meetings in his luxurious office to prepare Claire for the important events ahead. Claire was stunned by the contrast between her previous life and this refined and flawless environment. "They will notice if you don't know how to behave like a high society woman," Ethan said, handing her a stack of magazines on fashion and etiquette. "You need to look natural, like you belong in this world." Claire let out a dry laugh. "Because reading magazines about etiquette will magically turn me into a socialite?" "It's not that easy, Ethan." He smiled, despite the evident sarcasm. "Maybe it's not easy, but if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that everything is about perception. If you act like you belong, people will believe you do." The training session started soon after. Ethan was determined to teach Claire how to behave, speak, and even smile like a woman of the elite. He took her to expensive restaurants to practice table etiquette and hired a stylist to ensure Claire was dressed appropriately for each event. Despite their efforts, Claire felt uncomfortable in the role she was trying to play. "This all feels like one big lie," she said one evening while trying on a gown. "And I've never been good at lying." Ethan paused for a moment, observing her. "It's not a lie, Claire. It's more like acting. Think of it as a role in a movie. You're just playing a part that fits the narrative we need to create." She looked at him thoughtfully. "And you, Ethan? Have you ever lost yourself in your own role? Ever gotten confused between who you really are and the character you have to show to others?" Ethan hesitated before answering, surprised by the depth of her question. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's easier to be the character people expect than to be who you really are." Days went by, and Claire started to get better at the role she had been given. Although she was far from feeling completely comfortable, she learned to walk with confidence and keep an elegant smile, even when she didn't feel like it. Her conversations with Ethan, however, began to feel more natural and less focused solely on the deal. She teased him about his overly serious demeanor, and he discovered a lighter, more relaxed side of himself that he thought he had lost. During one of the training sessions, Ethan looked at Claire differently, almost as if he were seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "You're doing really well," he said, without the usual note of criticism in his voice. "If you keep this up, no one will suspect you're not one of us." Claire smiled, but her eyes showed a mix of sadness and defiance. "Funny, because I still feel like an imposter in a world that will never truly accept me." Ethan was about to respond, but held back. He realized there was much more to Claire than just a woman trying to pay off her debts. She had a strength he didn't expect, a strength that was beginning to shake the carefully constructed image he had of himself and the world around him. The night of the first big event arrived faster than Claire had anticipated. The ballroom was lit by glittering chandeliers, and the glow of the lights reflected off the elegant gowns and immaculate tuxedos. Ethan and Claire arrived together, all eyes on them as whispers filled the luxurious room. It was Claire's moment to prove to Ethan and to herself that she was up to the role she had agreed to play. "Relax, Claire," Ethan whispered, lightly holding her hand. "Remember what we practiced. Smile and keep your posture confident." Claire took a deep breath and nodded, recalling all the hours they had spent preparing for that night. Every movement she made was rehearsed, every smile calculated. But inside, she felt like an imposter, a misplaced piece in a golden puzzle. As the night went on, Claire surprised herself with her ability to keep up appearances. She followed the conversations, laughed at the right moments, and responded intelligently to questions about her relationship with Ethan. Ethan's partners and investors seemed impressed, just as he had planned. However, the highlight of the night came when Claire was unexpectedly called upon to give a brief speech. A wave of panic washed over her. This wasn't part of the plan, and she had nothing prepared. Ethan looked at her, his eyes full of confidence, as if silently telling her that she could do it. Claire stood up and, with a nervous smile, began to speak. "I'm not the best with rehearsed words, so I'll be honest," she said, feeling the attentive gaze of everyone in the room. "Being here tonight, beside Ethan, is something I never imagined. And what I've learned from him is that the most incredible people are those who are strong, not because they're perfect, but because they know how to admit their flaws." Claire's words, simple and sincere, left everyone in the room silent. She continued, "Ethan is a man who built his success with intelligence and determination, but what really matters is how he values the people around him. He taught me that sometimes the greatest luxury we can have in life is the ability to be ourselves." As she finished, the room erupted in applause. Ethan watched her, clearly impressed and perhaps a little shaken by the depth of her words. It wasn't what he had expected to hear, but somehow it felt much more genuine than any other pompous and rehearsed speech. When Claire returned to his side, still feeling the adrenaline of the moment, Ethan leaned in to whisper in her ear. "You were amazing," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity she hadn't seen in him before. Claire smiled, relieved yet confused by her own emotions. "I just spoke the truth," she replied, and for a brief moment their eyes met in a way that made both forget that this was all just a performance. As the evening went on, Ethan began to realize that something inside him was changing. Claire, with her authenticity and simplicity, was revealing a part of him he had buried under years of expectations and demands. He saw her not as a woman hired for a role, but as someone who, without meaning to, was breaking down his defenses one by one. Later, as they stood in a quieter corner of the ballroom, Ethan spoke, almost in a whisper. "I never thought you would touch so many people tonight, Claire, including me." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're so used to living behind appearances, Ethan. Maybe it's time for you to try being more real, too." Ethan fell silent for a moment, her words echoing in his mind. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe he had been hiding for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to be genuine. And somehow, this woman who had come into his life by chance was bringing that to the surface. After the event, Claire Parker returned to her small apartment with a sense of discomfort she couldn't quite explain. The elegant dress she had worn still hung in her closet, a visible reminder of the world she was starting to know, but at the same time, it seemed far beyond her reach. She sat on her worn-out couch and looked around her modest home. The walls were simple, the furniture used, but that space had always given her a kind of comfort that Ethan Caldwell's luxurious world could never offer. Claire was trapped between two worlds, and the line between reality and pretense was becoming increasingly blurred. The next day, while she and Ethan were having coffee in his office, he noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "What's going on, Claire?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "You've been different since last night." She looked up at him, unable to hide the inner struggle she was facing. "It's just that. I feel like I'm living two lives," Claire admitted. "In your world, I'm this sophisticated, confident woman. But when I go back home, I'm just who I've always been, a simple girl trying to get by. And those two parts don't fit together." Ethan stayed silent, reflecting on her words. He had never considered the impact this arrangement could have on Claire, beyond the financial aspect. "You know, you're doing better than most people I know in this world," he said gently. "You're authentic, and that's exactly why everyone was so impressed with you." Claire let out a low, ironic laugh. "Authentic? I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, to help you impress your partners." "This is all one big lie, Ethan." He leaned in, his eyes fixed on hers. "Maybe it's a lie to everyone else, but I felt that when you spoke that night, you weren't lying. You were being real. More real than anyone else in that room." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. There was something changing in Ethan, and it scared her. She was beginning to realize that the pretense wasn't just about pretending to be his fiancée to impress others. She was also starting to struggle with her own feelings, against the walls she had built around her heart. "It's not just about fooling others, is it?" Claire said, more to herself than to him. "It's about fooling ourselves, pretending that we're in control when, in reality, we have no idea what we're doing." Ethan didn't respond immediately. For the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. He felt that Claire was exposing a part of him he didn't even know existed. A part that wanted something more than just success and money. Something he wasn't sure he deserved, but that, somehow, she seemed to see beneath the facade he had built. "Maybe I'm starting to see things differently," Ethan admitted. "Maybe you're showing me a side of life I never really wanted to look at." The connection between them was growing deeper, and the line separating their business arrangement from true feelings was beginning to blur. Claire stood up, feeling like she needed a moment to process everything. "I need some time to think, Ethan," she said calmly, "to figure out where I fit into all of this." "I understand," he replied, respecting her need for space. But as she walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late to turn back. Not just for Claire, but for himself as well. It was a quiet evening when Ethan invited Claire to a more private meeting at his penthouse. He insisted it wouldn't be anything formal, just a way to thank her for her effort and dedication at the event. Claire accepted the invitation, though with some hesitation. Something in Ethan had changed since that night, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being uncomfortably close to him. They settled on the balcony, where they could see the city lights sparkling like stars spread across the horizon. Ethan poured a glass of wine for each of them, and for a few moments, they both sat in silence, taking in the view. "I needed a moment like this," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Something away from the formalities and the chaos of business. It's nice to be with someone who doesn't need anything from me except my honesty." Claire raised an eyebrow, smiling slightly. "Honesty? That's a funny word coming from someone who hired me to pretend to be his fiancée." Ethan let out a low laugh and shook his head. "Fair point," he admitted. "But I feel like since you came into my life, I've had to be a bit more honest, mostly with myself." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and a vulnerability she couldn't hide. "Who are you, really, Ethan? Without the masks, without the expectations of your family and your partners? Who is the man behind all this facade?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, taking a sip of his wine as if trying to find the right words. "I think for a long time, I was just what everyone else wanted me to be," he began. "The responsible son who would take over the family business, the leader who could never fail. I never stopped to think about what I truly wanted." Claire nodded, understanding more than he could imagine. "I've also spent much of my life doing what I needed to survive," she confessed, her voice softening. "I grew up in a home where every penny was counted, and every opportunity, no matter how small, had to be taken. Luxury and stability always felt like they belonged to another life, never mine." Ethan stayed silent, absorbing her words. Claire was opening a window into her world, a world so different from his own, and yet there was a truth in her that he had never found in the people in his social circle. "Have you ever wondered if there's more to life than just surviving?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "If there's something beyond other people's expectations?" Claire sighed and looked at the city lights, which seemed as distant as her own dreams. "Maybe I've dreamed of something more, but reality always pulls me back," she replied. "I always thought that love and happiness were luxuries I couldn't afford to want." Her words touched Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. He saw in Claire a strength and honesty that made him question his own choices. He felt a growing urge to protect her, not because she was fragile, but because she deserved more than life had given her. "Claire, I want you to know that, to me, you're already more than just a woman hired for a role," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're the person who reminded me what it feels like to truly feel, to want something that can't be bought or negotiated." Claire looked at him, surprised and touched by his sincerity. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her words almost a whisper. "I wasn't expecting to hear that from you." Ethan took a step closer, his hands reaching toward hers but stopping just before touching them. "I didn't expect to feel this way either," he admitted. "But here we are, Claire, and I don't know how to pretend that this is just a business arrangement anymore." Claire remained silent, feeling the weight of his words and everything that was changing between them. The line between pretense and reality was fading quickly, and what had started as a lie was turning into something real, something she didn't know if she was ready to face. As Claire and Ethan entered the luxurious event hall, the tension was palpable. This time, though, something was different. Claire's gaze was distant, as if every step she took beside Ethan pushed her closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. She knew that the words spoken the night before had changed everything between them, but she wasn't sure how to deal with this new reality. Ethan, for his part, was more restless than usual. He couldn't get Claire's vulnerability out of his mind. Every word she had spoken seemed to open a crack in his own heart, a crack he was desperately trying to ignore. At the height of the evening, when one of the most important investors suggested that Claire give a brief speech, Ethan was alarmed. He tried to intervene, but it was already too late. All eyes were on Claire, expecting her to charm the crowd as she had before. Claire felt the pressure, but this time, something inside her broke. She took a deep breath, and instead of delivering a safe and calculated speech, something in her rebelled against the lie she was living. "I want to be honest," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "because I can't keep pretending that all this is real, that it's just a role for me." The entire room fell silent, the guests' wide eyes glued to every word that left Claire's mouth. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding wildly. He knew something big was about to happen, but he had no idea what Claire would reveal. "I took this role because I needed the money," Claire continued, her eyes filling with tears. "I needed it more than anything else. But what I didn't expect was to find something more. To find someone who, behind the facade of a cold and calculating businessman, had a heart that I started to love." Claire's final words landed like a bomb in the room. A murmur swept through the crowd, and all faces turned toward Ethan. He stood still, his expression a mix of shock and deep emotion. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. She said she loved him. Truly. But before Ethan could react, one of the most influential and cynical investors in the room, Robert McAllister, stood up, laughing with disdain. "So this was all a sham?" he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You deceived us all, Ethan, and all for a woman you paid to pretend to love you?" Ethan felt his blood run cold. The look in McAllister's eyes was one of pure betrayal, and he knew the other investors were beginning to think the same way. His plan to impress and gain their trust was falling apart right before his eyes. "That's not true." Ethan finally found his voice, gripping Claire's arm as if trying to anchor himself to reality. "It wasn't a sham. At least not the way you think." But the tide had already turned. McAllister stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Looks like the big businessman was made a fool," he mocked. "And we were fooled along with him. If you can't be honest about something as important as your own life, how can we trust you to lead our investments?" McAllister's words hit like hammers, and Ethan felt each one sink deeper. Claire looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted things to go this far." Ethan slowly let go of her, his hand trembling. For the first time, he realized that in his desperate attempt to create the perfect image, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The once admiring and respectful looks from his partners and investors were now filled with distrust and disappointment. He hadn't just failed to keep up his facade. He had destroyed his career and his reputation. Before he could say another word, Claire turned and ran out of the hall. Ethan followed her, finding her standing outside, her shoulders slumped in a gesture of defeat. "Claire, wait!" he shouted, his voice desperate. When she turned to him, her eyes were filled with pain. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said, feeling his own heart break. "I know, Ethan," Claire replied, her voice choked. "But maybe it was a mistake from the start. We played with each other's feelings, and now we're here, in the middle of a mess we created ourselves." Ethan took a step toward her, but Claire stepped back, as if putting up a wall he could no longer cross. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said, with a look that held both love and deep sadness. "I need to go. I need to find the Claire I was before all this." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Ethan stood there, feeling that everything he had built had crumbled in an instant, and for the first time, he realized that without Claire, he was more lost than he ever imagined he could be. Ethan felt like he had been left adrift in an ocean of chaos after Claire's departure. That suffocating silence in the event hall, the feeling of being exposed and vulnerable in front of all his partners and investors, the betrayed look on Claire's face as she ran away, all these moments replayed in his mind like an endless film. He was used to having control over everything, but now, his life was in pieces and out of reach. Back in the solitude of his penthouse, Ethan stared at the city skyline that used to give him a sense of power and command. The lights of New York no longer seemed as bright, and all the glamour and success he had built felt insignificant. For the first time in a long time, he was truly alone, and that loneliness was no longer a safe refuge, it was a punishment. Ethan knew his reputation was in ruins. He had braced himself for losing his partner's trust and seeing his investments threatened, but he wasn't prepared for the pain of losing Claire. She was the only real thing in the midst of all that deception, and now, the one person who had managed to touch his heart was distant, hurt by his own actions. As Ethan sank into his thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Robert McAllister, the most influential partner, and the same man who had publicly humiliated Ethan at the event. The message was short and sharp. "We need to discuss your position at the company." You've put us in an embarrassing situation, and we are going to take drastic measures." He threw the phone onto the couch, frustrated and angry. Everything was falling apart, and he didn't know how to fix it. But more than the financial loss, what really hurt was knowing he had lost Claire. Not because of the money or the arrangement, but because she had challenged him to be more than he thought he could be, and he had failed. Determined not to let things end like this, Ethan grabbed his keys and hurried out of his penthouse. He needed to talk to Claire to let her know he was willing to fight for something real, something that couldn't be measured in stocks or contracts. He didn't know if she would listen, but he had to try. Meanwhile, Claire was in her small apartment, her eyes red from crying. She hated herself for letting her heart overrule her reason, for believing that a man like Ethan could truly see her as more than just a piece in his plan. She had fallen in love, against all her promises to keep things strictly professional, and now she was paying the price for allowing herself to dream. A loud knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. When she opened it, there stood Ethan, drenched from the rain that had started to fall outside, his eyes filled with desperation she had never seen before. "Claire, please, let me explain," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I know everything went wrong, but I need you to know that what I feel for you is real." Claire shook her head, trying to hold back the tears. "Real, Ethan? How can I believe that now? After everything that happened, how can I trust anything you say?" Her voice was full of hurt, but also of deep sadness. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I lost everything tonight, Claire. My reputation, my position at the company, the respect of my partners, but none of that matters to me now because nothing is more painful than knowing I lost you." Claire looked at him, her heart torn between the desire to believe and the fear of getting hurt again. "You say that now, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I'm not a safe bet for you. I'm not part of your world, and I never will be." Ethan reached out, touching her face with a desperate tenderness. "You are more real to me than anything I've ever had. Please, don't send me away. Let me prove that I can be the man you deserve." Claire closed her eyes, feeling his touch, but knowing she couldn't simply ignore everything that had happened. "I need time, Ethan," she finally said, her voice shaky. "I need to figure out who I am without all of this, and you need to find out who you are without the masks." She stepped back, putting distance between them, making it clear that no matter how much she wanted to believe his words, she couldn't give herself over to that story again without protecting herself. "Goodbye, Ethan," she whispered, before gently closing the door, leaving him standing there, alone in the rain. And for the first time in his life, Ethan knew that losing Claire was the most bitter defeat he had ever faced. The weeks that followed were a spiral of self-reflection for Ethan Caldwell. He had lost everything he once thought was essential: his reputation, his status at the company, and most importantly, Claire. His luxurious life seemed like an empty stage, filled with awards and achievements that no longer meant anything. Every detail of his lavish apartment reminded him of the loneliness he found himself in, echoing the emptiness left by Claire. At the company, the situation had become unbearable. Robert McAllister and the other investors wasted no time in removing Ethan from his position as interim CEO. He was now just another shareholder, someone whose opinions were no longer considered trustworthy. What surprised him most was that, despite the blow to his career, the loss that hurt the most was that of Claire. He realized that nothing he owned could fill the void she left behind. Determined to find meaning in all of it, Ethan began to distance himself from the bright lights and the masks he had worn for so long. He canceled social engagements, stepped away from parties, and dedicated himself to causes he had never cared about before. He started volunteering at shelters and investing in community projects, places where his wealth and status meant nothing. Ethan felt he needed to reconnect with the most human part of himself, the part that Claire had uncovered and that he had ignored for so long. One rainy afternoon, while helping out at a community shelter, Ethan realized just how much his life had changed. Sitting among people struggling to get by, he understood that he was experiencing a side of life he had always ignored in his bubble of privilege. But more than that, he was discovering who he was, when everything that used to define him had dissolved. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about profit, image, or status. He was thinking about how he could be a better person, someone worthy of Claire's love. Meanwhile, Claire was on her own journey of rediscovery. She had returned to her job as a waitress at a local cafe, a place where she felt safe and where no one judged her for what she had or didn't have. Every day was a struggle to forget Ethan and what they might have been, but also an attempt to reconnect with herself. One day, while closing the cafe, Claire found a notebook under the counter. Inside it, she began to write her thoughts, her fears, and her hopes. For the first time, she put into words the pain of falling in love with Ethan, the feeling of loss, and the uncertainty about the future. But she also wrote about her determination to find a life that was true to herself, a life where she didn't have to hide behind masks. She began to wonder if Ethan could really change, if he could be the man he promised to be that night when he begged for a chance. But more importantly, Claire started to wonder if she could let go of the fear and doubt to believe in something real again. As she wrote, something inside Claire shifted. A small spark of hope was born, the idea that maybe, just maybe, true love could exist, even in a world full of deceptions and masks. But she knew that before anything else, she needed to feel whole and secure within herself. She didn't want to be half of a complicated story. She wanted to be a complete person who chose to love out of her own will, not out of need. Across the city, Ethan stood outside the cafe where Claire worked. He wasn't there to barge back into her life, but to see if he could really be the person she needed, even if it was from a distance. He saw her through the window, focused on her writing, and a sense of peace washed over him. There was no need for words at that moment, only the certainty that, no matter how much he loved her, he first needed to love himself enough to be worthy of her. And for the first time, Ethan knew that his greatest challenge wasn't winning Claire back, but becoming the version of himself that she always believed he could be. Claire was in her apartment, sorting through her thoughts and trying to make sense of her feelings when an envelope was slid under the door. Intrigued, she picked it up, noticing that her name was written in handwriting she instantly recognized. It was from Ethan. Opening it, she found a simple note. "I finally found a place I'd like you to see. If you're ready to hear me out, I'll be waiting at the address below. Ethan." Claire hesitated, but something in her heart told her this was a moment she couldn't let pass by. She grabbed her keys, put on her coat, and left, determined to find out what Ethan had planned. When she arrived at the address, she found herself standing in front of an old community center that seemed to be undergoing a renovation. The place was decorated with simple yet welcoming lights, and there was a group of children and volunteers painting the walls with vibrant colors. Ethan was there, helping a little girl paint a flower, a smile on his face that was unlike anything Claire had ever seen. It was genuine, peaceful. He looked up and saw her standing there, surprised and visibly moved. "Claire," he said, walking over to her with a soft smile. "You came." "What is this place?" she asked, still processing everything around her. "This is the project I've been working on," Ethan replied, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I invested in this community center to help kids and families who need support. I want this to be a place where people can find hope without worrying about who they are or where they come from." Claire looked around, seeing the children laughing and having fun, and something inside her warmed. Ethan wasn't the man she had met before. He had truly changed. She saw it not just in his words, but in his actions, in the way he was engaging with these people. He had become the person she always knew he could be. "I did all of this because you inspired me, Claire," Ethan continued, his voice sincere and filled with emotion. "You showed me that there was more to life than I was seeing. And I don't just want to impress you. I want to build something real with you, something that's worthy of what we both could be together." Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She couldn't believe that the arrogant, controlling man she had known months ago was now this compassionate and selfless person, someone who truly understood the value of the little things. "Ethan," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you really made this happen. You became the man I always knew you could be." He took a step closer, holding her hands in his, and with a gentle smile, he said, "I became this man because you believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that it was worth believing." Claire smiled, the tears now streaming freely down her face, but they were tears of happiness, of acceptance. "I think we both became something better," she replied, laughing softly. "And I think I'm ready to see how far we can go together." Ethan leaned in slowly, and for the first time, without the pressure of a role or a lie, he kissed Claire with all the love and sincerity he felt. The kiss was gentle, sweet, and full of promises for a future built on the truth and love they had discovered. The children and volunteers around them cheered, some whistling and smiling, turning that intimate moment into a spontaneous celebration of hope and redemption. Claire and Ethan pulled back, laughing like two people in love, and somehow they knew everything was finally in the right place. Later, as they walked together through the community center, Ethan held Claire's hand tightly and looked at her with a sparkle in his eyes. "I have one more thing to show you," he said, gently guiding her to a small room with a sign on the door that read, "Claire Parker Writing Space." Claire looked at him, surprised. "What is this?" "I thought you might use this space to write," Ethan said, smiling shyly, "to inspire others with your words, just like you inspired me, because you have a gift, Claire, and the world deserves to hear it." She was speechless for a moment, touching the sign with her name, then looked at him with a wide smile full of love. "Ethan Caldwell," she said softly, "I never knew it was possible to fall in love with you twice." And this time, they knew there were no lies, no contracts, no more masks. Just two people, finally authentic, ready to face the world together. Do you think Ethan really changed for Claire? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what you think. Your participation is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.